want to introduce you to someone that most of you are familiar with, Dr. Charles Vore, in the Department of Archaeology.
Good to see you again.
At the University of Wyoming. It's good to have you here, and we're up in the Black Hills here. I'm just going to step out of the picture and let you explain where we're at and kind of what's happening here today.
Okay,
thank you. Charles.
Yeah, well, don't have that much to say here really. We're going to move on to take a look at a couple of archaeological sites, especially the Vore Buffalo Jump, which we're going to show you a lot of. But I guess I'm just here to say welcome to the Wyoming Black Hills. We just happen to be camping near Ranch A. Ranch A is basically it was a summer retreat owned by the Annenberg family, hence the A in Ranch A. And it's now a U.S. Fish and Wildlife fish hatchery area. It's world-class trout stream, white-tailed deer all over the place, turkeys. You got to kick the turkeys out of the way every day when you come out, you know, and so forth. But it's just a nice place to be. And this old lodge here, the Annenberg home, is what really lends some distinctiveness to the place. It's a log lodge that was crafted by a couple of local craftsmen of Swedish ancestry. They were renowned throughout the area as being especially fine cabin builders. And you take a look at some of the architecture here, you can see it is exceptionally well done. Some of the closest fitting logs I've seen in this kind of construction and so forth, and just a very impressive old building. Dates back to the 1920s, 1930s. It's on the National Register of Historic Places, and just something to see. I thought this would be a good place to kick off our tour here. So I'm going to be talking about the Vore Buffalo Jump. This is a version of a talk that I've given many times before, but one I never really mind giving. This is one of the most spectacular archaeological sites in the world. It's located in northeast Wyoming, up by the town of Sundance. It's a Plains Indian buffalo jump, as we'll see, with artifacts such as this arrow point being one of the things that is found. This is a map showing its location in North Wyoming, right next to Interstate 90, as we'll see, and between I-90 and the old highway. Sundance is this way, and South Dakota line just a few miles in the other direction. This is a color infrared satellite digitized image of the northern Black Hills. And basically a couple of things could be commented on here. First, you see the geography that has the central core of the Black Hills, and then you see the outlying Bear Lodge Mountains. This would be where Devil's Tower is and so forth. You also see here this, what is called the Red Valley, or the racetrack sometimes it's called. There's kind of an open grassy valley all the way around the Black Hills with encircling hogbacks, pine-covered sandstone hogbacks, but it separates those from the central forest. And this somewhat higher valley receives a bit more rainfall and is some of the best buffalo country in the world. It's just got good grass and good rainfall, and was obviously the site of really intensive occupation by Native American bison hunters, the Vore site being located about over in this area. The Vore site is located in a somewhat unusual geological feature. It's a large round sinkhole or subsidence. Apparently something in a cavern deep underneath of the ground collapsed, or it etched out this because of a large opening that was allowing water to flow down into the subsurface caverns. The Black Hills are noted for their cave-bearing formations, and apparently there are some cave-bearing limestones under this. So this large sinkhole is about 200 feet across at the top, over 100 at the bottom. It had very steep sides, 50 to 75 feet high, which served very well for a buffalo jump. Bison jumps are usually along lines of cliffs. That's what people think of usually, but this natural feature is sort of a buffalo jump in the round. Turned out to have been realized by any number of Native American tribes to be ideal for jumping buffalo, and that's the kind of feature that was used. This is a painting by Dave Pauley from Spotted Horse, Wyoming, commissioned by the Vore family to paint a picture, and it does convey something of the dramatic nature of a bison kill and so forth. It's a very interesting painting. I would say that the sinkhole here is much too small compared to the scale of a little artistic license there, and the buffalo should be smaller in relation to the sinkhole, but it does give people that are unfamiliar with it a sort of idea of stampeding the buffalo over the cliff. Nothing should be, there should be no mistake that, however, Buffalo jumping is a dirty, nasty, dangerous business. You are, after all, out on foot in the midst of one of the largest and most dangerous animals in North America. Sometimes the artistic renderings or accounts, in textbooks make it sound like the Plains Indian warrior gazed majestically at the distance. His wife flapped a buffalo robe and all the bison gaily leaped over the nearest cliff. It's not like that at all. You plan for months. You prepare for weeks and weeks. You get several tribes to come together, so you have several hundred people to mount this operation. You've scouted out the surrounding territory and located where the herds are at. At this time, buffalo are usually scattered out in small nursery herds of 30 or 40 cows and calves here and there, yet you need several hundred of them to operate a buffalo jump. Bison are not clumsy at all. They're very agile. They're extremely agile, and when they run up to something like this, they just put on the brakes and swap their ends and turn around and run right back at you. But if you have several hundred of them in a stampede, the front ones put on the brakes, but the back ones don't see it, and they crowd them over in all the dust and confusion of the stampede. Sometimes the rear ones will actually, in the dust, follow them right over the edge, and several hundred of them will plunge over to be killed and crippled and so forth, producing the tons of meat and meat products that were the purpose of the whole thing. So these people were able to take these smaller groups of buffalo and get them gathering together and clumping together. The buffalo would be out there 5 or 6 miles from the site and kind of nervous. They sense the presence of humans, one of their main predators, but they're not stampeding. They will scatter if you stampede them prematurely. But they're getting them clumped together into unnatural groups of several hundred animals, and they move them along and move them along. And they have drive lines out there that are piles of stone in long linear arrangements that are sort of navigational aids. They tell them about where on the landscape you want to keep those bison. And then when they get them close, suddenly at the last minute, maybe only 200 or 300 yards from the edge of this, they can even turn these buffalo at a right angle, but in any case they get them stampeding at people. That's when the people jump up from behind, hiding behind piles of rocks, and wave the robes and shout and scream, and they get the buffalo to stampeding in the right direction, and over the cliff they go. Buffalo jumping. The Vore site was discovered by core drilling for the construction of the nearby interstate. It was discovered by people associated with the Wyoming Department of Transportation, and they drilled in the bottom of this large sink and began to bring up all this bone. And they called Dr. George Frizen and myself down at the University of Wyoming, and we went up there and tested it, and lo and behold, what we found on the bottom was this Pompeii of buffalo jumps, this, as it's been referred to, the crown jewel of Wyoming archaeology. Here's a view of some of the excavations going on back in the early 70s. You can see perhaps a couple of people up here to kind of get the scale of this. This is the size of a 5-story building, basically. As we worked down into the bottom, we began to find level after level after level of butchered bison bone middens, we would call them. It took us 2 years to find the bottom of the darn thing, working our way carefully, excavating, mapping as we do, and so forth. The bottom of the sink turned out to have over 20 levels of bone in this portion of a profile. You can see some of these kind of horizontal levels, each level representing a time that might be 25 or 10 or 25 years after the prior jumps. Just began to fill up, and then they would have a jump and fill up some more and accumulate and have another jump and so forth. Each of these bone middens is a solid swath of bone ranging from kind of one set of scattered bones thick to levels that are 3 feet thick. And this is one of the middens. This is 40 feet of butchered buffalo bones, and it goes about 50 feet that way and 50 feet that way and 50 feet into the camera. That's just one portion of a giant heap of butchered buffalo bone that is 120 feet across. I try to look for ways to convey the scale of this site to people and come up with analogies or images like that. If you were to take these bone levels and unstack them and lay them out side by side, you would have butchered buffalo bone going for half a mile. If you took these thicker levels and kind of spread them out a little bit so that it was all just one mat of bone, you could scatter bison bones 120 feet wide and 6 miles long, just butchered buffalo bone. There were 17 million pounds of meat taken out of this site. All of this sequence occurred in only 300 years. The sinkhole was accumulating very rapidly, and so what you basically had was 300 years from AD 1500 to AD 1800. In that time period, these Plains Indian groups were able to run something approaching 20,000 animals over this cliff, and then it just covered up with a dense mat of vegetation, and then gradually soil washed over the top, and it just preserved it. It's the best preserved and largest bison kill that I know of. It goes down over 20 feet. These boards are 4 feet below ground where the bone middens start, and actually there's about 5 levels in here, the thicker levels you can see, and all the way down. In the bottom of the site, there was a pond over on one side for a while, and it formed these varved sediments. Varves are little laminated bands of sediment that form in the bottom of bodies of still water when the soil washes out there with snow melt and thunder showers, and it washes this sediment out in the pond and it sinks to the bottom. Then ice forms during the winter, and the fine particulate matter that's suspended in the water also settles down slowly. So what you get are couplets, they're called, and basically they're coarse and fine, coarse and fine, coarse and fine from the 2 seasonal modes. They are light and dark, light and dark, light and dark, and so forth. And they look for all the world like tree rings, and in fact they can be read just like tree rings, because a thick level is a wet year with more sediment washing, a thin level is a dry year with less sediment being washed in by rainfall. And here's a climatic record for about AD 1500 to AD 1650. Unheard of climatic resolution. Only tree rings can approach this. And in fact, I've been able to, in a preliminary fashion, cross-date these varve measurements with tree ring measurements and date these levels plus or minus about a year. So just one thing after another about this site is extremely exceptional. Projectile point unnotched form. The Vore site time sequence, those 3 centuries from AD 1500 to 1800, cover one of the most dynamic periods in North American prehistory. This was the time when the Great Plains Indian tribes were forming. Those bison hunting nomads, those horse tribes that became to, really they came to symbolize the Indian in many people's minds. The people that had those elaborate costumes and those modes of very formal warfare and moving from place to place. All of these people were not on the plains before AD 1500. The 12 or 15 or 20 tribes that we can name that were Western nomadic bison hunters all moved out onto the plains after about AD 1500 because of an episode known as the Little Ice Age. This is a plot of a tree ring sequence where the higher peaks represent thicker rings or wetter years. And basically there were several pulses of climate that made the area get even more rainfall than usual. The bison populations began to take off. I mean, there was just lots more grass, and the bison populations filled up those niches, and suddenly the bison populations reached those historic levels of 50 or 60 million animals. And all of those plains tribes moved out into the area to take advantage of those bison populations. These are possible users of the Vore site. The Lakota might have been there later when horses were being got from the Spanish Southwest and replacing the buffalo jump. The Shoshone might have been over there with the Crow or by their own. And certainly groups like the Kiowa and Kiowa Apache were in the Black Hills, and we suspect were using the site. The computer analysis of the projectile points does tell us that there are at least 5 separate groups that use the site, although it's very tricky to speculate on which kind of style of point associates with which group. I'll talk about that a bit more. So you had this sequence of increasing tree rings and all these tribes moving out there and jockeying for position and fighting with each other and making alliances, and some of these groups went on a grand spiral of migration that took them from Canada to Texas in 8 or 10 generations as part of these big territorial shifts. The only tribe that apparently has some historic accounts that might relate to the actual Vore site is the Cheyenne Nation. Just a few hundred miles north of here, up around Lame Deer, Montana, there's a Southern Cheyenne group down in Oklahoma. Old men like John Stanzentimber here have in their memoirs an account of a large buffalo jump near the highway outside of Sundance. It probably is the Vore site. The Cheyenne have now in the Smithsonian Hay Foundation for the North American Indian an ancient painted bison robe. It's recorded by William Wildschut in the 1930s that this belonged to a Cheyenne called Caller of the Game, a person who was important in bringing the buffalo in there, along with the actual control of animal behavior and the expertise they had. They certainly had a lot of ceremonial aspects, shamanistic aspects, ritual aspects, if you will, where usually a buffalo jump had a main shaman who was the buffalo caller, who would be using magic to bring the buffalo up to the jump. And then he supposedly would lure them in there and then get out of the way at just the last minute as they plunged over the cliff. This Cheyenne robe has pictures on it which can be interpreted to explain that there's a large buffalo jump in the Black Hills in a large natural pit. it was formed, according to the Cheyenne, by a tornado. So it's around, and it just has to be the Vore buffalo jump. The fact of the matter is that the Vore site is primarily a big grocery store, but the buffalo jump is always going to have ceremonial aspects, like I was just describing with the buffalo collar. And then down in the site itself, we have evidence for ritual activity in the form of bison skull circles. This is a portion of a skull circle coming around with the noses all pointed in, and then out beside it, it had paired skulls, two skulls, two skulls. There are probably about 75 bison skulls in what was really a medicine wheel made of buffalo skulls, and clearly was religious. I might add that as we continue our work at this site, we are talking closely to various Native American elders, asking about how we can interpret this in a sensitive way, and so forth. This site is really a place to celebrate the traditions, the heritage of the Plains bison hunters, and we're going to get a lot of help from the Native Americans themselves, of course. This is just a drawing that would show you we were looking at this over here. In another unit, it did come around. Some of the fine projectile point work at the Vore site. Top of a bone midden that's 3 feet thick. When we were excavating this, it was held in fluffy, loose brown dirt. The bones kind of look a bit disturbed here. That's because you would just brush the dirt away. It was just not like some of the middens where they were tightly embedded in the clay. This one was so thick that it was still contained in fluffy, brown, punky kind of dirt with a very pungent odor. Basically, it was held in 700 dead, rotten buffalo. It no longer had death and corruption smell to it, but it certainly was very odoriferous, and was just an example of what you get when you pile up that many carcasses. A shot of one of the profiles. Here you see some of the remains that are left after butchering, skulls being stacked up again in segments. I would maybe make a note here that these bison were all being intensely processed. I mean, we're talking somebody dumping 300 or 800 animals over a cliff, and then they're processing the heck out of them. It's common knowledge that, the Indian used all parts of the buffalo, but 100 some uses. But there's also accounts out there that in these buffalo jumps they would waste a lot of meat. And in fact, they did not. We have very little evidence for any of that kind of thing. They're taking these animals and they're zipping and stripping them down, and they're taking all the meat off, and they're cutting that into dried strips, making a kind of a jerky-like product. And then they're breaking out the major limb elements and taking 60 to 80% of the major limb bones don't even exist at the site because they were taken elsewhere for more intensive rendering. What they do is they break open the marrow cavity, and you get like 2 cubes of butter-like marrow out of every bone, and they put up literally tons of that. Then they would even take the articular ends of the bone, the joint ends on the ones with the more porous ends, and break them off, pulverize them up into small pieces, put them in pots of boiling water, and all the bone grease would boil up, kind of a soup bone sort of strategy. They would skim that bone grease off. Then when you pound your dried meat up into paste and combine it with the bone grease and the bone marrow, you have pemmican. People have heard of pemmican, perhaps. It's an extremely nutritious food. You've reduced about 3/4 of the weight by drying the meat, and it still has all the nutrition. Put some choke cherries in there for flavor. You seal it in a gut or rawhide bags. Or, our own ancestors always used to clean out intestines to make sausage, and this is a sausage-like product. But the thing is, when you seal the ends with grease, it will keep without refrigeration for 1 to 2 years. Very nutritious, very portable, and putting up tons of that pemmican was what it was all about. This is a view of the Vore buffalo jump, one side of it showing you that Interstate 90 is actually bent around the site. We worked in agreement with the Department of Transportation to bend it around the site, and here's the old highway that's on the other side. Shows you this red valley, I think a nice view of the grassy valley there. But being it has that incredible proximity to Interstate 90, where 4 million people a year go by, many of them, perhaps most of them indeed, people, tourists interested in the heritage of the area, we're trying to establish a research and educational center at the Vore buffalo jump. What I have in mind would be like this Native American Heritage Center in New York, to have a dome over that, to open up the scale of the excavations that you see there in these pictures from 25 years ago. We would have to have a dome over it to protect that. We would like to have a dome where we would have, see if this focus a bit, I guess. We'd like to have a dome-like structure where we could keep like a greenhouse atmosphere inside and then develop the bottom into an interpretive center and have museums up top. The campaign to do that has been kicked off here several years ago. We got the Vore family to donate the property to the University of Wyoming, about 10 acres surrounding for parking lots and so forth. We formed a non-profit foundation, the Vore Buffalo Jump Foundation, a bunch of really sharp, helpful people centered in Sundance, Wyoming, that are helping us raise funds for this endeavor. And we began to excavate small areas under the canopy and get busloads of school kids and do things like that. This year, June 28th, we're going to have, I think it's Saturday the 28th, we're going to be having busload tours all day from surrounding communities and bringing in potential donors and have a barbecue and just have a really good celebration like we do every year. So the site now is the subject of a development campaign, the ultimate goal of which is to come up with something like this, where you would walk down on a series of platforms and actually be able to walk right out into some of those excavations such as we just saw. That sort of facility will cost $7.5 million. We are at this time undergoing a stage development campaign where we start with small excavations, canopy-based excavations down in here, and then trying to build the first wing of this up on top, about $1 million project. It's just such a wonderful opportunity. There's no site more accessible, no site more dramatic in Wyoming where we could really bring this to the public. And we would tell them more than they wanted to know about the place, just like I'm doing here with you today. Our preliminary feasibility studies, marketing studies, and so forth show us that in a very cautious, careful mode, we could estimate 100,000 people a year quickly. Within the fact of the two of the nearby exits 2 miles away are exits to Devil's Tower, where they get 500,000 people a year, and the fact that we're right next to the interstate, we are being cautious so we don't have this pie in the sky kind of promises. But in fact, we're surely going to get several 100,000 people a year there almost immediately. And in a facility like this, I have a plan in line that would have essentially never more than 5 or 10 people in any one place. We've figured out how many people an hour during which peak hours and so forth. An important aspect of this is that it will pump millions of dollars into the local economy. Again, not just counting the same tourist dollars that everybody else is counting, but talking about what tourism will bring to this specific spot and so forth. We will start with $2 to $4 million in local economic impact. It's not counting all the turnaround and circulation of those dollars, and begin to gradually, over a 5 or 10 year period, pump that up to a $10 million enhancement in the local economy if we can pull this thing off. That's what we're doing there at the Vore site. Well, we thought we'd make a quick stop here at what we call Sand Creek Shelter. If we establish the Vore Buffalo Jump Research Center like I'm trying to do, we certainly will want to spread out and learn things at other sites. And this particular site is a huge rock shelter site. We call it a rock shelter in that many overhanging cliffs or alcoves or the front of caves were used by people for shelter. It keeps you out of the weather and so forth. And any archaeologist worth her salt that drives by here and sees this, immediately your antennas go up and you just think, whoa, this has got to be a site. We've got Sand Creek right there, we've got this big overhanging cliff, nice deposits. So I'd known for years that there had to be a good site here, and last year, with the kind permission of Dr. Joseph Ham and his wife Dorothy, we were given the ability to start a test excavation here. We tested right down there and immediately began to get into early historic, then prehistoric objects, camping material and chipstone and so forth. And in fact, we're down only about 1.5 meters, about 4 feet, and from the evidence of what we're seeing, we would guess we're back about 2,000 years. So who knows how deep this thing goes. This could be 20, 30 foot deep. This could go back many thousands of years. We don't know. I don't know if we'll ever know this site really well. It's just so big, but it really is going to enhance the chronology and everything we're trying to do here in the northern Black Hills. It's quite a site. There's about 200 or so inscriptions on here, people carving their names in there and stuff, and some of those are very early 1800s, people drifting by here. There's a few faint pieces of what is called rock art or rock images from the Plains Indian, a little teepee and some other things, some animals perhaps, but the rock's very soft and erodes and doesn't preserve the rock art well. I'm sure there used to be a lot of prehistoric rock art on this cliff as well. It's interesting that there's ledges up there that are kind of rock shoulders in themselves, and we have a bit of evidence to show that some prehistoric activities took place up on those ledges. So anyway, this is a site we're just getting started on. Come back in a couple years, we'll tell you a lot more, but it's going to be a very important part of our research program up here. Sand Creek Shelter. Very beautiful spot. Not often you get to dig in essentially somebody's front lawn and then go down in the noon hour and throw breadcrumbs at the trout, you know, but this is a nice place to be. Well, we're standing here on the rim of the Vore buffalo jump. This is peering over the edge, sort of a buffalo's eye view of what went on. Last thing the buffalo saw before they went over here. This site is a buffalo jump that's a bit unusual. Most of the buffalo jumps are on the long line of cliffs and so forth. This particular one used this large round sinkhole. It's a geological sinkhole or subsidence. Apparently there is cave-bearing limestones down here a couple 300 foot lower, and a cavern collapsed, or perhaps we had just a large solution feature where this was eaten away by water that had a clear drainage down into a big cavern system. The sides are about 50 foot high at this time, about the size of a 5-story building, and any area of this would have been completely a reasonable place to jump the buffalo. Any portion of this is steep enough and tall enough, if you were to stampede bison over the edge of this as they tumbled down, breaking legs and breaking necks and killing themselves and crippling themselves, you would end up with a lot of meat at the bottom of this. So basically we're standing on the top of a classic Plains Indian buffalo jump. The fact of the matter is that the Vore site, as we'll talk about, is one of the best preserved, and it is the largest and deepest buffalo kill basically that is known. There are some large ones in Canada that are comparable, and Montana had some that were so large they mined the bones out of them years ago to grind them up for fertilizer, and we're not sure, of course, then just how big those were, but there's no question that this is one of the largest and certainly the best preserved kind of buffalo jump. As you look around and think of stampeding buffalo over this, you would never want to have the idea that buffalo jumping was an easy or safe business. It was probably a hot, nasty, dangerous business. You are, after all, out on foot in the middle of one of the largest and most dangerous beasts in North America, and they would have to gather up several hundred of these animals to operate a successful jump. Basically, buffalo are an extremely agile creature, and when they come up to even something this precipitous, they put on the brakes and they have the ability to kind of swap ends and come right back at you. But if you have several hundred of them in a stampede, the front ones will put on the brakes, but the back ones will crowd them over, and down they go. It would take probably 200 or 300 buffalo. Now these bison are out there for miles, out in all directions in the gathering basin, and they're being gathered up and carefully brought together into larger and larger clusters until finally they have them herded in here basically, and then they only stampede them the last few hundred yards. A lot of people think they stampede them for great distances or something. You would lose control and they would scatter at that point. So just somewhere in here within a few hundred yards of this, they would do the thing that people are familiar with, where they jump up from hidden places and wave buffalo robes and shout and so forth and get the buffalo stampeding. Sometimes they had the ability, the driveline showed, to turn them at a direct right angle. I think the animals are a little less ability to control themselves. They're bolting a little bit more, and over the cliff they go by the hundreds. The fact is that this particular area here is kind of a low funnel-like swale that led up to the site with a very definite ledge down into these big chokecherry thickets, and this probably was a prime jumping point. But the other sides have advantages in that they're kind of up on a little rise, and you cannot see this sinkhole when you're 25 feet away from it. You get right up there and suddenly there it is. It's So those would have worked quite well for jumping the buffalo, and I think this is one where they could have jumped them from any direction. It's just an ideal buffalo trap. The Cheyenne tribe are one of the several tribes that used it. We think the Cheyenne tribes are one of the few that has traditions that relate to probably this very specific site. There's a buffalo robe in the Smithsonian Hay Foundation of the American Indian Museum that was belonged to a Cheyenne person called Caller of the Game, probably the shaman who led the buffalo in here and helped with the stampede. That shows that there was a especially productive buffalo jump in the Black Hills, any large natural pit in the ground. The Cheyenne talk about this place as it was caused by a cyclone or tornado, which makes sort of sense. It's round like that and all. Well, we've got just a bit of an excavation open down there. Why don't we go on down there and see what's going on? Come on, dog. I wanted to introduce you guys to Mr. Murray and his group here.
Thank you all for having us here today, okay?
They make educational videos, quite fine ones I might add. They did one on Pine Bluff a while back, and we immediately began to get increased interest and response. They have a satellite channel. They go out into 200 stations, you were telling me, and actually piped into 100 million homes, and their viewership certainly is measured in the millions, so you guys are going to be famous. Okay. Basically, as we've been talking about, we're involved in some research excavations here, just very small scale compared to the work that went on 25 years ago, and we've learned a lot. In fact, one of the reasons that we left this site set for 25 years was that we were just beginning to see how much we could learn from these large bone middens, these buffalo jumps, but we knew that we had a lot of development yet to do. We thought we better bring up some of our students and go get them into good PhD programs, and they could come back and teach us how to do it right. And one of my students, Dr. Larry Todd, is going to be here tomorrow and from Colorado State University, and he is widely respected as perhaps the very best expert on bone middens in the world. Has developed a lot of the methodologies that we'll be using. So in any case, we're also digging here because we want to open it up to the public and get some increased publicity and good public relations and show people what's going on here. We have the ability in this, setting up this canopy with kind of a gallery over here, to have people look right over our shoulder. We're trying to develop a research center here, an educational center, with the help of the Vore Buffalo Jump in Sundance, Wyoming. President of that foundation is Gene Gade, who's actually the University County agent up here, and he's involved. He's up at a 4-H camp right now working with children. He does a bit of everything like a good county agents do. And other folks on the foundation board are ranchers and businessmen and librarians and so forth. So we're getting a lot of help from the people here locally whose primary interest is in the educational value of this site. Certainly the I-90 is right out there, has about 4 million people a year, that drive right by here, and we're certainly trying to get a lot of those folks in here. We're looking at tourism, we're looking at economic development, and we're not shy about it. But we're really looking at that tourism as, we don't like the word like tourist attraction. What we're really trying to do here is do an educational and high quality, high standard approach to tell people about the heritage of this area, to celebrate the Native American heritage of this area. So we're working away into this bone unit here. I might just throw in a few other things about it. The fact of the matter, this is the top level of over 20 levels. They get thicker. You can see some of them emerging back here. Leo, could you step back? This is a old excavation unit here, so we're going down next to an old excavation unit, and down in here you can begin to see the thickness of some of these bone levels, and they just keep going down for 20 feet. We're standing here on a bone deposit that represents the killing and butchering of 20,000 animals, we would estimate. All of this took place in about 300 years, from AD 1500 to AD 1800. So it's pretty amazing to think of the expertise and hunting abilities that these Plains Indian folks had, where they could run 20,000 animals over the sides of this sinkhole and then render them down. The fact of the matter is that we intend to try to develop a research center, of ultimately a cover over this, turn it into kind of an indoor greenhouse and museum, and we can excavate here for decades. All of the large excavations you'll be seeing from 25 years ago represent only 5% of the site. The other 95% is still here, and we will dig here for decades and maybe dig another 10% because of the care and slow work that we do now. This bone bed here is one that we laid out last year. It took us 2 weeks to lay this out and map it and get control over it and so forth. And then we ran out of time, and as is common these days in these bone middens, we had to cover it back up and leave it here. It will take us a good share of the next week to pull this bone, and it's already largely recorded, but it's just a very slow, careful process. Every element here gets a computerized line of information that has about 30 different fields on it. 30 different things are going to be recorded. Elevations, orientations, type of bone, side up, things, comments about how it's weathered. These are dry bone breaks where the bone has snapped from soil settling after it's been here for a while, whereas some of these others have been eaten off by carnivores. They get in there and they actually chew that away, large carnivores like bear or wolf. And others of these have been fractured open to extract the marrow out of them. I don't see a lot of marrow fracturing here, and the reason is that they often take the bones away to do that. Something like 60 to 80% of the main limb bones, like this humerus here and so forth, are not at the site. They were taken away for further rendering. When you hear that the Plains nomads often wasted meat and so forth, we basically find no evidence of that in the archaeological record, and they're butchering and rendering down hundreds of animals at a time and wasting nothing, taking tongues, breaking open bones, basically stripping the animals of all their products and leaving scatters of bones. The butchering of this represents 16 million pounds of meat that were got here in 300 years. We take elements like, say, these mandibles or lower jaws that are most common, and we can estimate how many animals. There's parts of about 7 animals scattered through here, if I remember correctly. Well, that's 7 times the amount of meat they're getting there. That's about 5,000 pounds of meat represented here. And when we go into the next unit, there'll be more parts of more animals. So that's 5,000, 10,000, 15,000, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000, 50,000. This strip across the site represents about 60,000 pounds of meat. That's 60,000, that's 120,000, that's 180,000. You get the picture. There was a lot of good food taken out of this site. When the people were able to have a buffalo jump like this and put the products up into storable fashion like pemmican, they had a rich, secure winter, a leisurely winter. They would be in the teepees during blizzards, telling stories, playing with the children, visiting relatives, and so forth. If they didn't get a good fall and autumn kill with a lot of meat, then they were out hunting in bad weather. Grinnell reported in 1920 from conversations with Cheyenne men in the turn of the century that still remembered those, and he spoke of it in terms that although the Cheyenne made some provision against time of need, like many Plains tribes, they also faced want. When there was no food in the village, no matter how tempestuous the weather, the men were obliged to hunt, often caught in raging blizzards, freezing hands and feet. I wish we could speak and write as well as those folks do. This probably represents the Cheyenne folks here in these upper levels. Down below we have arrow point styles to show us it's different people. We're not sure who they were, but groups such as the Kiowa and Kiowa Apache, who were in the Black Hills before the Cheyenne, and then in fact ending up clear down in Oklahoma and Texas, Shoshone, Arapaho. All of the tribes that you know of as the Plains tribes were not on the plains before AD 1500. They all moved out here to take advantage of these increasing bison populations. There's a climatic episode represented here in these 300 years known as the Little Ice Age. And the moisture really kicked up, the grass took off, the buffalo populations increased by the million. People back east said to heck with this farming and just went out and started hunting. It was actually a more secure and better lifestyle to be nomads than it was to do their Father De Smet in 1843, I believe it was traveling through the northern boreal forest just up into Canada and the homeland of the Cree. And he was expecting to do his missionary work, and he could find nobody. And he writes in his diary something to the effect of, "Though we traveled for many days, scarcely have we met with a single hut. For the ancient lords of the forest are here no longer. The Cree have gained the Buffalo Plains, and they contend for them there with the Blackfoot, whose mortal foe they have become." He talks like that, you know. We have to use these little bamboo picks because they don't scar the bone. We commonly use these trowels. In fact, all those pictures you saw there were dug with these, basically. But we've learned through the years that too often you get little scarring on the bones that could be confused with prehistoric cut marks, stone tool cut marks. And so now we come down on the top, find the bone with trowels and stuff, and start easing down around it. But the final excavation is done with these little bamboo picks because it won't scar the bone. What else can we talk about? We hope to have people looking over our shoulder, and we hope to be having them, you know, see these excavations go on. And then as we finish these, we'll turn these into interpretive displays. We'll turn them right into museum displays. Every bone has a story. Last year, and we'll do it again this year, we made little labels up and put them by each of these bones, and it gave a little bit of information. For example, this bone over here, if you look at it closely, this bone right in here is one that clearly is a massive snap break. That animal broke its leg when it tumbled over the cliff. And then different kinds of things. So there's a little story there with that bone. These mandibles here, these are mature mandibles. There's one way down over here that it's an immature mandible from an immature animal. When you look at the tooth eruption and wear, you can say how old that animal was. And since they have a very delimited birthing season, you know how old that animal was. You know what time of the year within about a month that these animals were killed and butchered. So we can say that in AD 1729, in the fall of the year, there were 700 bison killed, and on and on and on, you know. Exceptional preservation here. A lot of times in these bone beds, older ones, you have to plaster jacket those and remove the bones, you know, to keep them together because they're all fractured in bad shape. These, as you can see, are still kind of hard and yellow and shiny. This excellent preservation. Look along here, I see tool marks from being cut by a stone knife, different things. Here's a lower limb element that has what we talk about as articulation. The hock basically was cut off here, and then here's the toe bones, and then we're missing down to the hoof cores and so forth. So lots of different things to be seen in here. Shoulder blades over there, different limb elements. Those maxilla over there that Craig is working on, point that one out with a tooth row in it there, Craig. There's 3 of them in there. Just down one more notch. No, the tooth row. Yeah, right in there. Those are actually the upper jaws that are attached to the skull normally, but they've been butchered off of the skull. They're actually going in, opening the mandibles out, taking the tongue out, breaking the skull open, getting little bits of marrow and things that are up in there. So really pretty intense kind of butchering going on here. Don't have a lot of our recording methodology going on right now. We're getting ready to do that. We will take EDMs up there and get precise horizontal and vertical coordinates to the nearest millimeter. And as I say, all kinds of other recording goes on before we pull these bones out. When you excavate an archaeological site, you're basically disassembling big chunks of it. And you have to do as precise a recording as you can to justify that. You have to be able to essentially put that excavation back together in the lab, as it were. So, standing on top of 20 levels of 20,000 dead buffalo. It's pretty amazing. Sometimes I look for ways to convey the scale of this, like the 60,000 pounds of meat routine there. But in fact, if you were to take all these bone levels and unstack them and lay them side by side, you would have butchered bone for half a mile, 120 feet wide. If you took the thicker levels and kind of spread them out so it was just one bone thick, I mean thicker than this, just one solid bone, but not that thick, you spread them out, you would have bone going for 5 miles, just it's laying down in here. Just unheard of sight. And all of that with the best preservation and so forth. We hope to get people by here and tell them more than they wanted to know about this, just like I'm doing with all of you here. A joke I use sometimes.
bones as they come out? Do they go to a museum at the university?
Yes, we will be taking these out. Each one get wrapped in tin foil, and we will take them down to the university laboratories, and then the analysis just continues. We'll be taking a series of more observations and doing studies of activity structure from our maps, butchering locations and age of the animals to talk about herd structure and get a better handle on the ecology. Lots of different information there.
Did you get the dome built you were talking about earlier? When you get it built, or you'll have displays here at that point in time?
Yes, in fact, we're involved in a stage development program where right now, get a canopy up, get hundreds of people by, have the ability to talk to them about it and look over our shoulders and then seal it up and leave. Our next stage is going to be to try to build a building up on top of there, which would be a world-class museum and interpretive center. And then as we get that really established and snowballing, we would be able to perhaps put a dome over this and more lab facilities. Now at that point, all the bone would stay here. We would be able to curate it, work on it, analyze it right here. The nice thing would be then as part of our tour, you would be able to go right through the labs. I don't like this philosophy where, you know, you have a heritage center or a museum or something and there's something going on back through those windows, but you can't really get in there. I want people right in looking over our shoulder in the lab. And we can do that at a place like this. I don't like the philosophy that is sort of a, well, I suppose you would say, I don't want to offend anybody, but sort of a park ranger approach where you've got somebody whose job is to be an interpreter, and after they've given the same rap about 10,000 times, you can tell, you know, they say, no, over here is clearly shown to be, you know. What we like to do is get people in here looking over shoulders and interact with the crew and ask them questions. Give them a little basic tour, but then, hey, what do you want to hear more of? And have them, you know, talk to the crew. And like we do down at the High Plains Project in Pine Bluffs, a lot of the students get pretty darn good at that, but they only have to do it for a day at a time. They get rotated through tour guide duty, and so they're always fresh and really also know what's going on, can answer the questions. So that's part of what we hope to do here.
Well, I think that's an exciting plan, and I think that certainly the American people as well as visitors of the country are going to look forward to enjoying that. So we would like to have the right to revisit you in a given period of time and check on that progress and see how things are going along.
Yes, we'll welcome you with open arms. You have an open invitation to come back anytime.
Great. What happens then with the soil that they are removing, say at this time, and putting in these containers?
Okay, basically we work down through the cultural level, or a good share of it, leave the bones on pedestals like this. Then the matrix, as we call it, has to be further processed to pick up on those small little flakes and things we might be missing. There's two aspects to that. One is that no matter how carefully you dig, small things are sometimes missed, and that's how they're recovered. The other aspect of it is that it's cost prohibitive to get every single item in place. Sometimes we have what we call cutoff points. Everything below a certain size is not mapped in place. That cutoff is usually like a half a centimeter or centimeter. Anything larger than a centimeter, anything even this big right here, is mapped in place, given a number, put in a bag. That's how we can control what went on with the site. Now that matrix then is taken over to a series of screening procedures, and we work through there and recover those small bits and pieces that we're missing. This particular square right here is a 50 centimeter square, or a quad as we call them. It's part of a 1 meter unit, and that 50 centimeter square is screened separately. So if we find some item we've missed, we can at least pin it down to that exact square in about a 5 centimeter level.
Could we see a bit of how that screening process works?
Sure. Not a lot of it going on over here, but let's go and stroll on up there. Is this some of your dirt here, Leo?
Yeah.
I'm going to take it over there, see if they need it, okay? Well, you guys are about to screen before millions of viewers. How are you guys controlling for this? Just general floor sweeping at this point? And it's all going in the same bag?
Yeah, we've got separate.
All right. Now look like you're enjoying yourself.
So just what are you doing, lady?
bone or debitage out of the soil. So far we found bone, small chips of bone.
So debitage I refer to are the sharpening flakes, small bits of glassy stone that are pried off of, basically napped off of the tools when they get dull, and so we can locate the type of tools and their use location by finding the small flakes in the screens.
Is there any reason all the men are under the tent and you two are after the sun?
Just the way it worked out.
Luck of the drawer.
Could
We
you
were under the tent earlier.
could you show us some of the pieces that you found in your screening, please?
Show from the pit.
Yeah, these are from some of the soil in the pit.
I should mention that those are being recovered because of wall slumps and cleaning up last year's excavation and so forth. Normally those things would be in place. These are just a sort of a cleanup routine as we get started. Wouldn't want any of our colleagues to think we're throwing out bones that large.
Right.
It's just bits of butchered buffalo bone, and like all the bones down there, we have to have the ability to look at that and say, okay, that's coronoid process off of a left mandible from a mature animal, and those can all be identified as to the type of element they came from, and hence lots of detailed information about butchering from any of these materials.
Sarah, could I ask why you have interest in archaeology? Why did you choose this field? Do you find it exciting?
Well, yeah, it is. It's one of the more interesting fields that you can get into. But I was in range management, and I started to learn a lot about the environment and ecology. And when I took my first intro to archaeology class, I started realizing that the environment had a lot to do with figuring out what was going on, in the past, and that there's a lot of ways you can learn about what people were doing with the environment from the environment they were living in.
Great.
And,
it's kind of our heritage, isn't it?
Yeah.
It really is. Would you recommend the University of Wyoming and the Archaeological Department
I think
there?
it's a great department.
Well, great, great. Thanks very much for sharing this time with us.
Sarah's from down in that Laramie area, I guess, ultimately. But we have people here from Missouri and Montana and Easter Island coming down over there, and a little bit everywhere. So,
well, I think it encourages young people to, if they're interested in that sort of thing, to know it's possible. It's possible.
Can be done. And it's a, kind of a outdoor, kind of a exercise-based endeavor in the summertime. You get to get out in places like this, and then you also get to work in the lab in the winter, do computers, do microscopes. It's technical and it's physical, and it has a lot to offer, we think. Yeah, this Vore site is a very special kind of place. Woody and Doris Vore, the owners of it originally, used to come over here in the evening and just sit here and look into it. There's just something about it. Maybe they sort of sensed that down under here there was something special going on. And it certainly was special to the Indian people that earned a living here. You look around you with all this lush green vegetation, and you have this big circle of blue sky above here. There's just really an unusual view here. And down deep into the bone levels, we have circles of bison skulls that are basically 50 skulls or a nose point in, where essentially a medicine wheel of bison skulls. Certainly any kind of endeavor like this would have involved a lot of religious ceremonies. To the Native American, the buffalo was, of course, a very special animal, very sacred animal. They would never just go out and hunt buffalo. They would offer prayers first, ask for the animal's forgiveness for killing it, offer prayers afterwards, and thanks for the bounty of the land. And I think this place had to have a special meaning because it's round like this. The Cheyenne, if they're referring to this site, in any case said they had a buffalo jump in a pit that was made by a tornado. So that's kind of interesting to think about. But the circle to the Native American is a symbol much like our Christian cross. It's a very important symbol. It means a lot. And in using that symbol, they talked about the curve the buffalo horns made, part of a circle. They talked about the teepee being round. That's a circle. They talked about putting the teepees in a circle, in a big camp, and that was the circle of the people. To them, the circle meant that we're all part of it together, that it's all part of the environment. Sometimes you see that even perhaps in a corny way in television, but it's true. To them, the circle meant that we're part of this earth and we have to respect it and live with it. They talked about the circle of the medicine lodge. They talked about the fact that in some instances a powerful buffalo shaman would build a medicine lodge and cause it to rain on all sides and be a circle of blue sky overhead. And the reason they wanted it to rain on all sides was more grass and, yes, more buffalo. So the circle was really something and to those folks, and this is a place that's got a circle in it. So just thought I'd mention that interesting aspect.
Dr. Vore, thank you very much for having us back, and we look forward to more back down at Pine Bluffs. Now, with this being a nonprofit venture, can anyone that wants to donate to it and assist in protecting the heritage of our great nation, our history?
Certainly. Because of trying to bring out the story of this particular site and the fact it's so accessible, we do indeed have a development campaign to build a museum here. People can get information from the Vore Buffalo Jump Foundation in Sundance, Wyoming. It's on the internet now. Or they can write to me at the University of Wyoming, and we would be very appreciative of any kind of help, donations, or just if they're interested, what can we tell them? So.
With your permission, we're going to give them those addresses on the character generator here. Thanks again. It was a real pleasure.
Well, it's always a pleasure to have you here.